One way to view Mary's blessedness is to consider all the gifts God gave her. A better way is to reflect on all she was asked to give, those 7 sorrows, which culminated in Christ's crucifixion on Calvary, where our Blessed Mother silently pleaded on our behalf, though it pierced her so. Our presenter tonight has much to share, but his instruction, while conveyed in words, is more in the spirit of Mary, she of few scriptural words, helping us draw closer to the Lord through the blessedness of being asked to give a lot. Won't you please welcome my classmate and friend, teacher Fritzky.
I want to thank Frank especially. I want to thank all the good priests here, Father Mitch, Father Rich. I also want to thank Father Joseph Riley from the Immaculate Conception Seminary at Seton Hall for joining us for a bit tonight. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's especially nice to be here on the feast day of your Our Lady of Sorrows. I can skip a lot of what I had to say early on because Frank covered much of it. So there's no need to introduce myself to you. I had a full life, got to do many things, and then life took a turn. I am going to read this, however. There was never enough money when you have 12 children, you know, and there were far too many miles. I once counted, after I got sick, I counted the number of miles that I rode on Route 80 alone over the years. It was 1,300,000 plus miles. It was 12 pairs of sneakers and not one. And my son Tommy told me, and this was devastating to me, "Daddy, Daddy, I love you, but please don't sing." I had sung the kids to bed for years, and he took me out. The tally for the oldest 4 daughters alone, and my first 4 were daughters, in the first year of their driving, and this is all true, was 2 blown transmissions, 2 seized engines, and 8 accidents. And Maggie made the hamburger pie, and I made the French toast and Taylor ham after Mass on Sunday morning. And our Christmas mornings were always a sight to behold. And in the blizzard of '96, I love this. My little Joey ran through the house. There had to be like 48 inches of snow outside, and he said, "Wake up and smell the deck." We watched blood gush out of their little heads, and we saw seizures on the sidelines at football games. And we rode with them far too often in ambulances, and we lived to tell. Our oldest Maggie, I like this story, and this was true. She now lives about 15 miles away from us with her husband and 4 children. When she was a senior in high school, she was the oldest, so she took the brunt of 12 children. She swore she was going to kick the dust of Stanhope, New Jersey off her feet and never, ever return. And she came right back home. We were always the butt of the "Have you tried TV?" or "Do you know what causes it yet?" jokes. And every day was never without its own surprise, and life was lived on the edge, but it was full and blessed. The seminal event, and Frank spoke briefly about it, and the defining moment of my life was meeting Neisseria meningitis on a beautiful early October day in 2005. The contrast has often bewildered me. It was the brightest of suns, the clearest of blue and inviting skies, and there was this stalking death in it. My temperature that night topped out at a staggering 108 degrees. In rapid succession, renal, respiratory, and circulatory failure followed. My kidneys crashed, as did my lungs, and the blood no longer flowed through my body. Within hours, the purpura fulminans, I learned all these fancy terms afterwards. The purpura fulminans turned all of my extremities, including my nose and ears, a rich purplish black. Maggie was told that I would not survive the night, but I surprised them. And she was told the next morning that I would not survive the transport to Morristown Memorial Hospital, but I surprised them. And I went on surprising them, living on death's door for about the next 6 months. More than 90% of those who get my strain of this particular disease die, and most within the first 24 hours. And my doctors tell me that I am the only person over 50 to ever have contracted it who survived. I was in a coma for 3 months, and for a long time thereafter, my fever would periodically top out at 107. I remember the ice blanket over me. I remember the bags of ice being tucked on my sides. And I remember 2 of my little boys with their ice table next to me, where they'd put the compresses on any part of my body that weren't covered. What wasn't amputated, completely atrophied, giving way to another fancy term that I learned, heterotopic ossification. That means all my joints froze up and gobbledygook grew in them, new tendons, new tissue, new bone structure. Both of my hips later had to be operated on because bone locked the hip in place. New bone formed. Crazy stuff. I went through, after that, 9 months of extremely painful and difficult rehab, and I was fully 15 months away from the warm shores of Maggie and home. The final price paid was 441 straight days of hospitalization and rehab. 2 feet, 2 legs, 9 1/2 fingers, a mouthful of teeth, the end of my dashing races to the car, late as always for the next meeting, the end of basketball games with my boys, the end of hikes in forests, the end of socks and sneakers and golf clubs. That was particularly tough on me. And the onset of a constant chronic pain. But head and heart were against all odds intact. I had been extravagantly upheld by the love and prayers of so many. Blessed I had a story to tell about miracles and the power of prayer and never ever giving up and rejecting fear and maximizing the power of the strength within out of what was a kind of unforgiving tragedy and utter darkness for a long time and unbelievable suffering. There was reclamation and this impossibly improbable new life. My body had been forever broken, but I saw with eyes that were wide open, and my spirit exalted and magnified the goodness of God. Inevitably, I found myself, after a long battle, at the Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation, right next door to you in West Orange, where for some 7 months, they worked to restore movement and life. There were many intermittent trips back to Morristown for more surgeries, but I was basically a Kessler. There I met, on one of the first days that I was there, a pretty young girl of 19 from South Hackensack. It had been just one foolish and sudden dive into the pool in the safety and sanctity of her own backyard, and a broken neck and paralysis. In turmoil, a profound sadness dripped from her. She hurt in a way that I had never seen anyone hurt before. And we happened to share the same mat in the morning for physical therapy, and we were placed at the same table in the afternoon for occupational therapy, as there was no age discrimination. So she was stuck with me. Initially, I just hoped to cheer her up somehow, some way, just a bit. I tease her about what a smile from her would do for everyone else around her. Gently, humanely relentless, I joked, cajoled, and offered words of wisdom and hope that always seemed to fall short. But day by day, I never let up on her, prodding, smiling, cajoling, calling her out. And finally, the worm turned as she came back to life. And in time, her smiles did indeed come to light that place up. Before she left, we met in that gym and put our best into what I like to call the limited mobility wheelchair to wheelchair hug. You know, she softly whispered in my ear that she thanked God every day that I had been there for her. And that was it. That was the moment that made Neisseria meningitis and near death and coma and amputations and all the suffering and this brave new world that I was living worthwhile. I remember thinking I would have gone through it all again, all the pain, and would have been a brutal fight for life just for that one moment. She, in a few words, gave it meaning and purpose. Good God, I had been there for her, and she for me, as God had planned. In that I had to be broken myself in order to be what I was for her, it then struck me for the first time that there was in my very brokenness an absolute perfection. As such, acceptance was never an issue for me. While the seeming absurdity of this thought puzzled even me, I was rather grateful to be what I had been invited to be. And there were so many others. I'll talk to you very quickly about just a few of them. Ray was a quadriplegic. He had been a member, and Ray and I, we were always the first ones out in the courtyard in the morning. He had been searching for a way out. He was a member of the Bloods, and for that sin, he was shot in the back of the head and in the back of his neck on Central Avenue in Newark in front of his 3 tiny little girls. Still marked for death in that culture, his grandmother, upon his release from Kessler, was going to take him, his wife and girls, to Alabama to get away. By the way, there were quite a number of Bloods and Crips at Kessler with me. Mortal enemies on the street. They got along just fine behind the red brick walls of Kessler where the bullets didn't fly. You know, this is a sidebar here, just very quickly. I remember a night we all had to be taken out and moved to an ancillary building because they were going to do some electrical work. So a lot of poor people who were used to being in bed at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock were up into the late hours of the night, and they were doing anything they could to try and occupy people to keep you going. And they played bingo, you know, and my occupational therapist, James, was by my side, and he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Rich, look right over there." And you saw 4 gentlemen with dreadlocks, you know, having a happy-go-lucky good old time, slapping each other in the back, high-fiving each other over a bingo game because they were apparently winning and they were enjoying it. And James just goes to me, "Rich, a blood, a crypt, a blood, a crypt." That was Kessler. I think of this girl, Donna, a young woman who drove the car that killed 3 of her friends and paralyzed her. The catastrophic physical impact paled in light of the emotional and psychological devastation. Every day, we would talk about the need to forgive, and not a day goes by that I don't think of and pray for her. Paul, once my roommate, I was in Kessler back when they used to have 4 men to a room. I got to live 8 days in the single bedroom in the new building. But so we were packed in pretty tight. And this guy, Paul, came to us one day. He was older, and he was in deep, deep trouble. He was probably the neediest human being I ever encountered. His cries for help never ceased, and his moaning and groaning was constant, and he couldn't rest. And I remember the first night he was with us, nobody could sleep because it was constant, and one guy in our room insisted on leaving, and he yelled and screamed and demanded that he get out. But Lawrence and I stayed with Paul, and eventually this guy, Dan, joined us. And this is a true story, that this was constant. Initially, you were all upset. This was not good, It was unhealthy. We were not going to be able to get any rest. And it was amazing how quickly the worm turned for us with that, because he was this pain at first, and how quickly it became our own. How quickly his needs became our needs, and how quickly we made that transition. And all of us were fighting for him and yelling to get attention for him, just as he was doing. And then one night, I said, Paul, do you think it would help to pray? And he was unable to articulate words anymore. By the way, he had been a professor of ethics and philosophy at no less an institution than Columbia University. But I knew him in that state. That was my Paul. I asked him if it would help to pray. All he could do was nod. He just nodded in assent. And so we started to say the Our Father. And Lawrence prayed it out loud with me, and Paul just listened. And then we prayed St. Francis's Prayer for Peace, my favorite. And we said it over and over again. And for the first time, Paul rested. He slept. He found some peace. Some of you may remember him well with the great, most valuable player, shortstop for the New York Yankees, Phil Rizzuto, who was there for 5 months with me. And I was somehow given the grace to complete the sentences that he could not. And I was somehow given the grace to tame the tears that he could not. And there were so many others, and I could go on and on. My point is, we redeemed each other at Kessler. It was, to me, a most holy place, as it was we who suffered together, who healed what the doctors and the therapists could not. But in the heart of my own redemption were my Maggie and her love, and that of my 7 daughters and 5 sons, which everywhere exploded and reclaimed. I met death a number of other times, most recently when a kidney transplant on July 14, 2014, was met by a pulmonary embolism. The ramifications of the meningitis led to crisis after crisis over these past years, and more surgeries than I care to remember. 5 in just this past year alone, the most recent a colon cancer. Again and again, I found that the doctors spoke first, but that God spoke last. The meningococcal bacteria, for instance, fries the neocortex of the brain. Every time it does this, it destroys the home of all the good stuff, of wisdom, emotion, memory, knowledge, etc. About 6 weeks into my coma, my doctors met with Maggie to talk to her about the fact that my brain was gone. It had been lost to the deadly bacteria and to what they described as thousands of mini strokes. She was told then that even if I were to awake, I would neither recognize nor know her, nor my children, nor ever again be able to utter a cognitive thought. Yet here we are on September 15, 2015, and I'm still uttering away. They actually described my brain to her as Route 80. They said it was Route 80, but there's no access or egress anymore. There are no roads to get on, there are no way to get off. That the connectors had been fried, they were gone. As this is backtracking a bit, as I was so very sick and in acute shock on the second day of this battle with the meningitis, I have no memory of this. But I am told that I spoke with Maggie and a few of my children who were with me just before I disappeared into that coma. And what I said was, I'm going to rest easy. So I want you to rest easy as well. Just pray and keep the faith. Believe as I believe, and all will yet be well. It's interesting to me when I think about that, for while I had physically in shock bailed out, my faith had not. So when Maggie told our children about the devastating news about my lost brain, they revolted in light of what I had said. And Maggie worried so. about their denial. Until I woke up, I'm told 3 days later, scanned the room, spotted her, and said, "I love you." Just 10 seconds for my eyes immediately closed, and I went right back into the depths of that coma until I woke up and asked to see my boys. A cognitive thought, a complete sentence, just a moment's grace. And while my doctors feared that Maggie was delusional, we had witnesses, and Maggie knew that I had a mind to stay. This phenomenon was reconfirmed years later by a Dr. Leon Smith, who's, I'm told, the guru of American infectious disease doctors, who, when we met, smiled, shook his head, and said this, and I quote him verbatim: "In 50 years in infectious disease, I have neither seen nor heard of anyone, not a one, ever going into a meningococcal-driven coma for any extended period of time, who ever came back whole or lucid until you." Now, I don't go where miracles are. No one considers themselves worthy of miracles. I look upon it as grace. I've just had some grace showered upon me. I happen to be, in my next book, which Frank also mentioned, which will be released on November 3rd, is a Civil War tome. So I happen to be a student of history, and I know a great deal about the Civil War. General Robert Edward Lee, who commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, was likely the most beloved commander in all of history. And he was the living paradox of the Christian humanist warrior soldier. And after the war, when he served as president of what is now Washington and Lee University, he hosted a reception. And the story goes that he was approached by a young woman who asked General Lee, "What must I do to lead a good life?" We are told that he thoughtfully and affectionately cupped both of his hands over hers and said 2 words only: "Deny yourself." A best life, deny yourself. That was his prescription for living. Deny yourself, as I have been asked to do. I have learned, as upside down as this sounds, that in the very sinew and marrow of suffering, there is to be extracted a rare joy. For the suffering and faith need only take you to higher ground. It is the invitation that demands that you try to look at everything as God does. It's the invitation that demands that you stop looking temporally, but rather spiritually. The book that Frank mentioned that I present to you today, A Pilgrim's Song, is very much related to my own experience, which I just related. A labor of love, it is about my Aunt Mary Varick, my sweet mom Rose's sister, a holy woman and a beggar for God, who brought her Simons and Veronicas, or volunteers, in service to her disabled together to find purpose in love. They would gather monthly, and she took them on pilgrimages near and far, but every summer, at least to the great shrines in the Quebec province of Canada, they would go. They would also go to Fatima Lourdes in Rome the first time in 1967 with 66 in wheelchairs, 5 on stretchers. And so the begging by my aunt for volunteers, for help, for money. Her youngest brother, 2 of her younger brothers, 2 of my mom's younger brothers, were both priests in this diocese. Father John Cassidy used to lovingly warn all that the only hope they had of avoiding my Aunt Mary's clutches was distance. Yes, he'd say, keep your distance, because once Mary got to you, you were gotten. And once gotten, he said, you were gotten for good. Her misty eyes, disarming smile, and a voice that melted butter conspired together to conjure up the yes that she was looking for. I have a memory in my home Usually Aunt Mary would arrive unannounced. But this time, she actually let my parents know that she was coming. And my dad was just reaming it into my mom, no this time, Rosie, not this time, not this time. Because whenever Aunt Mary comes, there's going to be a question. There's going to be a request. You never knew what it was going to be. You know, we took children in for parents who went on pilgrimage, and you know, it was always picking up some disabled person here and getting them to the first Saturday there, or somebody needed help, or you need to buy books and reams of raffle tickets or sell them or whatever. And so my dad was just saying, not this time, Rosie, not this time, no. And I remember that. And I remember when Aunt Mary arrived, we had to carry her up the lower steps and up the steps, and all us little boys felt really proud of doing that. And you get her in the house, and she'd get into the dining room, she'd sit at the table, and then she commanded the audience. It wasn't that she demanded that. She had kind of this, you know, attraction that just led everybody to her and glued them to her. And then they would talk about all things Varick and Fritzky and Cassidy, and then she'd get in to the latest dramatic story. And she would near bring everybody to tears, and after she did that, then the question would come as to what she now wanted you to do. And I remember this so vividly, my dad saying, no, Rosie, not this time, no. As soon as Aunt Mary popped the question, my tough World War II medic of a father, strict disciplinarian, just said, why, sure, Mary. Yeah. You know. Lucky you, Mary would insist, as she met her new disabled. Your disability only gives you the luxury of spending more time with God. To the beaten, broken, and catastrophically injured, who were then outcasts, unwitting outcasts in a society that was so unforgiving, she'd say, don't you realize how blessed you are to have received a special invitation from God to become the most intimate of friends? The unafflicted, the enabled, they're busy. They're all madly rushing around. They're working, they're shopping, they're doing all manner of things. But you, lucky you, who are physically broken, you have time for God. You can give to God what most cannot, the hours in your days. In a society that then deemed them invalid, as in not valid, as if to be tossed aside, Mary rather deemed them blessed and privileged. It began with prayer, but she would then ask them to give their pains and sufferings away to God. To do so would render them sacrificial instruments of transformative grace, a grace that would be freely showered upon others, a grace that would then render them redeemers. Invited to be a redemptive force for others, she said that their suffering was ultimately a blessing, an invitation to do the greatest work that anyone could possibly do. She'd say, kings and presidents don't get to do the work that you do. You are invited to help carry the cross for Christ. It is an invitation, I'm sure, that many of you here at Our Lady of Sorrows also have been extended. I was drafted into Mary's pilgrimage army at either the age of 14 or 15, as were most strapping young boys in our family. The mind may have been set on baseball and swimming, but off you went, no matter the protest. But then you fell in love with the disabled, your fellow volunteers, and the spectacular shrines of Quebec, like Saint Anne de Beaupré, where our Blessed Mother's mother is celebrated, and Our Lady of the Cape, where our Blessed Mother continues to pour love and grace down upon the suffering and sorrowful who come unto her. There it is impossible not to feel closer to God, impossible not to feel our Blessed Mother's great love. When reflecting upon the Stations of the Cross, as my Aunt Mary often did, on the beautiful grounds at those shrines, she would emotionally remind everyone that it was in and through Christ's suffering and death that Mary's tears and sorrow washed away the sins of the world. One with a boundless love, she bled with Jesus and emptied herself completely for our salvation. A Pilgrim Song, my book, Mary Varick's Story, celebrates Our Lady and her great love, the Eucharist, the carrying of the cross, and Mary's own irrepressible faith and relentless service. In it, you'll meet many other saints, and you'll be touched by every one of them. You'll meet Flossie Oates, whose home in Jersey City was part homeless shelter, part soup kitchen, and part Goodwill Exchange. And while Mary's ministries were ecumenically Catholic, Flossie in the African American Baptist community of Jersey City became the mightiest of all of her fundraisers. You'll meet Jeanette, who lived on a stretcher. I remember Jeanette well as a little boy. She could neither move nor see. The only movement she had was a little bit on her neck. She lived by Holy Rosary Church in Jersey City, and she was as happy as anyone could possibly be. She was strong as Joan of Arc, and she gave her entire life to prayer. And every time the bell would ring on the hour then from Holy Rosary, and on the hour, that was the cue for Jeanette to switch her prayers to the next cause on her list that particular day. All I remember as a young boy was the beautiful smile on her face. Could not move at all, could not see, lived that kind of empty, closed life, but she was remarkably purposeful, vividly faithful, in love and in joy, still celebrating life. There was Straight Ed. I love Straight Ed. His spine had been fused and he could never sit down. And he liked to always say to my Aunt Mary, who was always in a wheelchair, "In your heaven, Mary, there will be a pair of dancing shoes, and in mine, a soft, easy chair." Among the larger than life in my Aunt Mary's life was someone I'm sure you all well know. Her dear and intimate friend, Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Once Mary confessed, I discovered this by going through all the notes and all the correspondence that I could get my hands on. Of course, I couldn't see Mary's letters, but I could see the letters that were saved, that came to her. And this one from Mother Teresa clearly indicated that my aunt must have said something that went along the lines of, "What's a little schlep like me doing my little thing here in northern New Jersey, hanging out with someone who's worldwide recognized for this wonderful work that she is doing for God." This was Mother Teresa's response, and this I did see. She wrote, "Your work, Mary, is just as precious to Jesus. Shelter and food and bread can always be found and provided for the homeless and hungry of the world. But the poverty that you address, Mary, is so much more painful. How many lonely, unwanted shut-ins are there in your land of plenty? Each time you bring your First Saturday family to Mass, as you go from parish to parish, it becomes an eloquent sermon. Willing volunteers give of themselves to care for your severely handicapped members who have learned to carry their crosses for Jesus, offering them to Him through Mary for peace in the world." Oh, what an eloquent sermon, Mary. Never underestimate your work. Never. Mother Teresa once told Mary's oldest daughter, Billy, who was dying of arterial lateral sclerosis, that they made a perfect team for Christ, and that she could not do what she did for the poorest of the poor without the prayers of those like Billy, who could give so much time to God on behalf of her work. If you offer these long, hard days for me, said Mother Teresa, and I offer my tired working days for you, together, Billy, we become a perfect act of love for Jesus, and both of our lives become precious and holy. It all began for my Aunt Mary when, dying with terminal bone cancer, she visited Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré, just north of Quebec City. The cancer was, on July 21, 1951, left at the altar there. But her precious place at what she called the foot of the cross, however, was, as she prayed, preserved. The cancer was gone, just gone, but the polio, contracted when a toddler, kept her in the wheelchair. Another friend was Archbishop Peter Sutton of Manitoba, Saskatchewan. In testimony about Mary, he wrote, "It is through much suffering that we come to God's kingdom," which is my humble and intimate way of saying that if Mary isn't in God's heaven, I'm not too sure at all that I can put human terms to expressing what heaven is all about. Among all of my acquaintances, this woman of the cross, this joyful, wheelchair-bound lady, has surpassed any teaching I've ever had on the meaning of Jesus' passion and Jesus' love, I love this sentence, for the faltering followers of an unbounded hope in the great reward promised by him to those who allow themselves to love and to love without ever counting the cost. Father Jacques Renfort was another close friend of my aunt's, and he wrote this about her. He said, "I envied Mary the intimacy that she reached with our divine Savior, and I know that one of the great graces that I will have to render account for at the end of my life will be to have known Mary Varick so well and not to have done enough." The heavy crosses that weigh on each of us have been placed there by the Lord himself. And the only element of choice which is ours is whether we will sanctify our sufferings and our losses for the love of God, or whether we will squander our chance for sainthood away in useless complaint and discontent. Father Renfort's words always remind me of John's Gospel, where Jesus affirms that there will be suffering and struggle and tribulation in the world. But take heart, he says, for I have overcome the world. What Mary lived, what my aunt lived, and what I live, and what your Our Lady of Sorrows manifests, is that suffering is only a gift. Suffering, a gift. On the one hand, you must never walk by the suffering of your fellows in Christ. You must own their suffering and own their pain. And yet, on the other hand, at one and the same time, suffering need never have dominion. It need have no dark power when it is offered up for others, and God is invited to be with you in the pain itself. I long ago discovered that. I vividly remember asking for pain to be removed. Help me, take it away. And I came to discover that all I really needed to do was to ask the Lord to join me in the pain, to be with me in it. I still practice that every day. And when I do, what seems intolerable is made tolerable every time. Yes, own their suffering as you must, but also celebrate with those who willingly carry the cross, for we know that the cross is ever so much more than the wood of Calvary. And in the name of redemption, use suffering as the force for goodness and grace that it can be. Like my aunt, I have learned to thrive where the suffering is. and to strive, to try, as Father Renford so powerfully suggested, to both sanctify that suffering for the love of God and to heed Mary Varick's constant cry and call to lift high the cross, the love of God proclaim, as do you. That's why you're here. Oh yes, lift high the cross, cried Mary Varick, for we lived the cross, you and I. She would have you know that in your struggle, in your pain, in your humility in accepting that, in the very perfection that lies in the heart of all that may be broken in you, you do join Christ in redeeming the world. We are called to be strong, to be brave, to be a blessing to one another, to be redeemers. Obviously, I sell books. I discount them for $15, but any and all purchases will be appreciated because they only help me to buy more books and to do good things with it. My daughter Noelle has set me up inside this a flyer with some information about Mary's ministries that are still ongoing and that eloquent sermon that Mother Teresa wrote about. It also includes information about the book, website, and all that other nonsense. Bless you all for bearing with me. Thank you so much for having me. I want to especially thank my old friend Frank, because he's the one who got me here. And I know the hour is probably moving on, but I love questions. I love comments. And when I get them, that's where the good stuff really happens, when you make presentations like this. So anything you have to ask or say would be most welcome. It only takes one to start. And then if I get none, then I feel terrible because I feel I fell flat because no one even had a thought to follow. Yes?
In your suffering, have you ever questioned why you are suffering? And also, you have done things that are not supposed to be done, ordinary.
Mm-hmm. What I have struggled with, these are just sidebar tales, but I survived the 9th Syrian meningitis. There were only 8 other people in the state of New Jersey who got it that year. The other 7 all died. They were all much younger than me. They were all around 22, college age. And none of them made it through that first 24-hour window where everything just blows up on you. And so I remember even then saying, well, why?
Yeah.
Why am I still here and they're gone? And I've asked that repeatedly again. I remember people visiting me when I was in crises who have since died of cancer and passed away from all kinds of other maladies. I said, why? They were strong when I was dying, and yet I'm still here. And so you ask that. The only question why, I don't ask about what has become of me. I ask only about why I'm still here and what that purpose is. I think to some degree this book is part of it. I think to some degree my being here tonight with you is part of it. I love the opportunity to do this. I love the chance to talk about it. And I think that maybe, just maybe, I'm answering my own question in our being here together here tonight. That's a pretty good ringtone. Wow. But as to why did this become of me? Never. I do not ask why about that. I do not point the finger, and I do not complain. I have never complained about any of it. But of course, my Maggie always checks me at the door, at least not about the stuff that matters.
Right.
I complain about all the little stuff, but not about the real stuff. Yeah. Yes?
Are you always in such a great spirit every day, or is there a time you wake up with like,
Well, there are times you you become more reflective, and there are times you just, lay back and take it in. But for the most part, I'm always in a good mood. People marveled even when I was still in the dying stage. As soon as I got the opportunity to, I smiled. I smiled through it all. It's interesting. At St. Barnabas, when I got the kidney transplant a little over a year ago, and the very next day I had the pulmonary embolism, and that was a bad time. It was new kinds of pain, and I was in such trouble, and I knew it. And afterwards, there were about 15 nephrology residents at St. Barnabas who were always around me, and I remember asking one of them when they knew I was in trouble, because they saw me and they knew that something had gone terribly wrong. And he said, because you had stopped smiling. He said, you smiled when you came in for the surgery, you smiled in recovery, you smiled in your room that night, and the next morning we saw you and the smile was gone. So I think, that smile, I've been upheld by great friends. I've been upheld by people who stay with me, and I think that smile has been good to me over time. Yes.
I think your faith has something to do with that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I know you were going to say something just before.
This is very practical.
Sure.
You're a writer, and obviously the writing is in your head. But how do you manage practically to publish?
God gives you little gifts. I tried all the voice recognition software stuff. I cannot function with it. It never seems to obey the orders, and believe it or not, I write with this little stub of a finger that was left to me, and that's how I punch the keys on the keyboard. And I'm actually pretty fast with it. And people say, well, aren't you a bit slow because you're only 5? I say, no, it just gives me the time to be a little more deliberate and thoughtful, as I write. So I've written a couple of books for a few people. Since this happened, I got the opportunity, as Frank mentioned, to work with my close friend George Martin, who was the captain of the Super Bowl Giants of '87, on his book Just Around the Bend, about his 9/11 walk across America experiences. I wrote a book about my Aunt Mary. I wrote a book that was always in my head about the third day at Gettysburg. I tell the story of that day through the mind, heart, and soul of that one leader who called all the questions and made all the decisions there. But I reflect upon it all. And I reflect upon words of importance to him, like faith, like duty, like family, like holiness. And, in that I try and pull something out of that should matter to all of us today. It's not just about their last full measure, i.e. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address at Gettysburg. It's about our full measure and what we're called upon to do and to be. I'm working on another book, working title is Tidings of Great Joy right now, and in the back of my head I have this Conversations with Lincoln book that I hope to get to someday.
Greatest impact of this experience of yours on your children?
I think it impacted all of my children. I know their lives were turned upside down for quite some time. I'm still learning about what they lived and went through and where their heads and hearts were. Years ago, I thought I knew it all, and I've come to discover that I knew very little about it, so I'm still learning more. I think some of them struggled to some degree before it, but some of them have taken off to do special things with it. My son Joe just started his clinical rotations, having finished medical school, at St. Joseph's in Patterson. And I know he's going to be a great doctor, and it had everything to do with what he experienced, with what I went through. I turned life upside down on my kids because they didn't just lose their father for those months. The days when all was at issue, Maggie was always with me. So Maggie wasn't home either. So, the children were scurrying, all over the place, and it was tough. One of my sons, the only thing he knew for sure is that there was always plenty of food, because food was pouring in from the neighbors all the time, and that there was never places to put food away because there was too much of it. So I know they were fed, but it was, I think.
Richard, I have a question.
Sure.
As I've mentioned to you in the past, you are a true inspiration to those of us who know you. But when do you feel closest to God? The more you suffer, or the less you suffer?
That's an interesting question, and I never quite think about it in those terms, but I think probably the more. I think the deeper you go into the depths, for me at least, the more I feel that presence. But I feel it right now. I feel it with you. I feel it talking with people about this. I look at your face, and I'll never forget the moment. I talk to you about this all the time. But on one May 3rd morning, when we were juniors at Seton Hall Prep, I work my way. I leave Hackensack at 5:30. I get to school, and we get to homeroom, and the morning announcements are that my uncle, who was a priest at Seton Hall University, teaching theology, had died the night before. And I remember thinking that not many of my fellow students knew that he was my uncle. And so the morning classes were canceled. We were all going down to Walsh Auditorium for Mass. And I remember leaving the auditorium, and I just want to kind of remove myself from the phalanx of students in our blue blazers, marching off. And I just went off to the side. And Louis, who just asked me that question, he was the one person who walked over to me. And he so very kindly, asked me how I was doing, and with the loss of my uncle. And he also seemed to know that he was close to me. So great people. Frank, have I babbled on too long?